Hi, everyone. We're happy to turn to our last but not least meeting today. Let me introduce you Joseph Straus, distinguished professor of the Graduate Center CUNY. Joseph is a renowned music theorist of North America, mostly by his works regarding post-tonal music analysis, which have become classical ones, and also by his disability studies in music. Today, he'll give an introductory lecture on what disability studies in music is and why is it important to talk about that. Please feel free to ask questions during the lecture in chats. We'll have an opportunity to elaborate on it. And also, please be active. You'll be also able to ask questions in person after the lecture. And now I'll translate it to Ukrainian. Вітаю всіх вас. Сьогодні ми завершуємо перший день нашої конференції виступом Джозефа Страуса, професора Graduate Center CUNY в Нью-Йорку, який відомий своїми роботами щодо посттонального аналізу. Ці книги стали класичними для студентів університетів Північної Америки тут. А також він відомий своїм дослідженням у сфері фізичних і просто порушень в музиці, і, власне, різницю між тим, що можна досліджувати в сфері disability studies, тому що такого ідеального перекладу українською цього терміну немає, він розповість сьогодні. Будь ласка, почувайте себе абсолютно вільно, ви можете питати будь-що в чаті, ми можемо зупинятися, якщо це будуть цікаві коментарі, і пояснювати це, а також будуть моменти, коли Джозеф буде питати якісь, питати щось, і ви можете відповідати на ці питання в чаті, або піднімати руку і відповідати самі. Joseph, I think I've done all introductions, so you shall begin.
Okay. I want to thank you all very much for inviting me to talk with you today. And I especially want to thank Lisa Sarenko, who is studying with us at the Graduate Center this year, and the other organizers of this conference. I understand that to organize a conference like this, or really to do anything normal, is extraordinarily difficult during this terrible war. Let me say it right at the outset that I consider the talk that I am giving today an act of solidarity with you and with the Ukrainian people as they fight for their freedom and for a return to a normal, peaceful life. At many points in this presentation, I will pause for questions and comments by you, and I hope that you'll freely use the chat to communicate with me at any time that you have questions or comments, and Lisa will moderate the chat and pass your questions and comments on to me. Okay, I want to talk today about musical modernism, by which I mean the mostly dissonant and atonal music written in Europe and North America between roughly 1900 and 1950. I'm going to argue that the most characteristic features of modern music, the very things that make it modern, are all about disability. That is, they're about human bodies that do not appear or function in normal accepted ways. But before I get there, as a sort of preface, I want to introduce you to a relatively new interdisciplinary field called disability studies. Disability studies is the study of disability as a cultural practice. Of course, disability is also a concrete physical reality, a property of minds and bodies. So let's start out by thinking together about what sorts of bodies and minds are usually thought of as disabled. So here's one definition offered by Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's one of the leading figures in disability studies. She says, disability is an overarching and in some ways artificial category that encompasses congenital and acquired physical differences, mental illnesses and retardation, chronic and acute illnesses, fatal and progressive diseases, temporary and permanent injuries, and a wide range of bodily characteristics considered disfiguring, such as scars, birthmarks, unusual proportions, or obesity. Even though the prototypical disabled person posited in cultural representations never leaves a wheelchair, is totally blind or profoundly deaf, most of the approximately 40 million Americans with disabilities have a much more ambiguous relationship to the label. The physical impairments that render someone disabled are almost never absolute or static. They are dynamic, contingent conditions affected by many external factors and usually fluctuating over time. And here's a similar definition by another leading figure in disability studies named Jackie Leach Scully. She says, disability is an organizing idea that has to hold together a daunting variety of body states, some universally agreed to be disabling, and others whose status is more contested. Sensory impairments, she means things like blindness and deafness, mobility restrictions, missing or lost limbs, skeletal dysplasias, including restricted growth, morphological anomalies ranging from conjoined twins to extra toes, genetic syndromes with complex phenotypes, cognitive impairments and learning difficulties, mental illnesses, disablement due to chronic illness such as HIV/AIDS or metabolic dysfunction, and neurofunctional disorders. The concept of disability also has to cover impairments with different origins, and it has to account for the fact that there are people with the same bodily variation who disagree on whether they are disabled at all. So we're talking here about a huge variety of physical and mental conditions. Some disabilities people are born with, others are acquired later in life. Disabilities may result from genetic abnormality, from traumatic incident, disease, or other cause. Some are permanent and some are temporary. And one may be disabled in varying degrees. That is, you could be disabled to a greater or lesser extent. Basically, any condition of mind or body that deviates from a normative standard for good health can be thought of as a disability. And the whole question of disability becomes particularly pressing during a time of war, when all around we see extensive serious injuries to minds and bodies. As you're probably aware, in the universities of North America and the United Kingdom, the past few decades have seen a proliferation of so-called identity studies fields. The best known of these focus on race, gender, and sexuality, and we find fields like Black studies and women's studies and queer studies. The focus is on these categories not as natural and permanent, but as contingent, contextual, constructed. These are social and cultural constructions. In the past 25 years or so, a similar critical lens has been applied to disability, and here's a definition in one of the standard texts in disability studies. Disability studies explores the social, cultural, and political dimensions of the concept of disability and what it means to be disabled. Disability studies conceives of disability as a form of embodied difference that can be studied similarly to race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. It views disability not just as a legal designation or medical condition, but as an arena of social contestation and an identity category in need of analysis across time, geography, and culture. So what I'd like to do now is summarize 7 main arguments made by disability studies, and I'll pause after each one to see if there are questions or comments. So contention number 1, that disability is a social or cultural construction, not a biological or medical given. Disability is relational between people and culture. It's not a pathology that adheres in a body. And this is one I want to pause on for a moment because this is often confusing to people. People think, well, if you're blind, let's say, that's a property of your body. In what sense is blindness a social or cultural construction, not a biomedical fact? And I'll issue that as a question to you. And I hope that some of you will try and answer the question. In what sense is blindness a cultural construction, not a biomedical pathology that resides within an individual's body?
You can put your answer in chat or answer in person if you wanna just join us.
Does it make sense to you? Does it seem obvious to you that that's the case, or does it seem strange to you to think of blindness as a cultural construction?
Владислав Усатенко.
Hello, dear Joseph. As I understand, maybe in some social way, blindness can be not responding to present events or some like historical movements, when you don't react to any circumstances around you, or don't put your don't consider yourself as a part of some social group. Maybe you are not involved in this system. Maybe blindness, something like that.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, what I hear you saying is that blindness is not something experienced in isolation by an individual, but something that is experienced in the social world. The way someone might live as a blind person, the way other people respond to their blindness, the way they themselves think of their blindness, how they are caused and how they choose to live in the world. All of those things are social issues. They're not medical issues. The blind person is not in pain. They don't have a disease. They have a particular bodily configuration. And the way in which that plays out for them in the real world is going to be a social issue, not a medical issue. And so that brings me, well, we've already talked about the second point, that disability embraces a wide variety of human embodiments. So basically, my definition is extraordinarily broad for disability. Any deviation from normative standards is or can be thought of as a disability. Now, someone else has posted here. Lisa, would you like to read that to me, please?
Yeah, sure. Alona Dorosh wrote that I think that blindness in social terms is the unwillingness to perceive irreversible and existing things, despite irrefutable facts and evidence of the existence of something.
Okay, I mean, that's a really interesting point. So, for all the disability conditions we'll be talking about, there is an irrefutable, concrete, biomedical, somatic, physical basis. So I'm not arguing that these things are not real or just in your mind or something like that. I'm just saying the way they're worked out in someone's life, in the way they live and are permitted to live, that's a social thing. That's a choice that people make. It has to do with the built environment. It has to do with the social environment. So your experience of blindness is going to be very, very different depending on where you live, when you live, what community you live in, what the prevailing attitudes are. All of those things are going to shape your experience of blindness. And so will the prevailing cultural attitude towards blindness. Are going to the way people think about blindness is going to shape your experience. And that's what I mean when I say it's a social or cultural construction. So bodies differ. I mean, all of us have different bodies, shapes, and appearances. Sometimes some of those differences are stigmatized in some way, are punished, are dealt with harshly, and people who have those kinds of bodies often are treated badly. And again, those are cultural choices. Those are social and economic choices. Those are not inherent in the quality of a body. All right, disability studies positions itself against what's called the religious model of disability. The religious model of disability, well, let me again ask that as a question. Can you think, if you think about sacred texts, the Bible, for example, how is disability thought of in the Bible? Can you think of any disabled characters in the Bible and how they acquired that disability and how they get treated as a result of that disability?
Even I'm trying to think now what I remember from that, but actually I'm not like a fan of.
Okay. Leprosy, for example, blindness. Samson is blinded. St. Paul is struck blind on the road to Damascus. There's blindness, there's deafness, there's infertility, there's all kinds of disabling conditions in the Bible. And usually the Bible understands those conditions as an outward sign of evil. And the disability itself is a mark of God's punishment. You did something bad, and now you're being punished. and the visible, your blindness, your disability, whatever it might be, is a sign of God's disfavor. And you still, even for non-religious people, often this religious model persists. So there are plenty of disabled conditions where people get blamed for the condition, like it's their fault, they're not a good person. So obesity, for example, is a bodily condition people get blamed for and stigmatized. And people say, well, it's your fault because you don't have self-discipline and you don't exercise properly. And so we're right to punish you for your obesity. Or people, if you think about, well, we'll get to cultural representations in a moment, but if you think about all kinds of disability, I'm thinking about HIV/AIDS, for example, okay? HIV/AIDS was understood by many people, and perhaps still is, as a divine punishment for sinfulness and immorality. I hope I make it clear this is not remotely my view, but I'm just saying that the religious idea, the idea that disability is a punishment for a sin, that actually is not just in the Bible, but that's still part of contemporary life, and disability studies pushes back against that. Even more, disability studies pushes back against the medical model of disability. The medical model of disability, as we've already suggested, is you have something wrong with you and it's up to the doctors to fix it. But disability, the idea that something is wrong with you because you have a disability, that's a cultural idea, that's a medical idea, and you don't have to think about disability as a medical pathology. You can think about disability in other ways, as we'll say. All right, disability has a history into culture. Its conceptualization and its lived reality vary with time and place. I gave the example before of blindness, and I'll give another example right now of deafness. There's a history of deafness. There's a history of people who think of themselves as deaf and are thought of as deaf. They have institutions, they have deaf schools and deaf universities, they have deaf theater, they have deaf music. There's a whole culture and history of deafness. It's not just a measurable hearing impairment, it's a way of being in the world. And that's what I want to get you to start thinking about disability not as a medical condition, a negative medical condition, but as a way of being in the world. Disability interacts in complex ways with related sociocultural categories, also with apparent biological basis. So we'll take race, for example. The biological basis of race is very much contested. And in fact, most biological thinking about race, it turns out to be entirely false. Race is a cultural category. It's a social category. It has very, very little to do with biology. And one of the things that scholars of race talk about is the ways in which race functions socially and culturally in the world. And it's the same thing with disability. In both race and disability, you're talking about bodies that differ in some way from a standard, from the prevailing norm, and are often stigmatized as a result. And in both cases, disability studies and critical race theory push back against that idea that there's something essentially biological about these things and turn their attention instead to history and culture and society. All right, disability is widely represented and narrated in literature and other forms of artistic expression. These representations and narratives both reflect and shape conceptualizations of disability and the lived reality of disability. So here we start to bring the discussion close to music. The idea here is that the way people think about different disability conditions is both reflected in and shaped by the things that they see and read. So there's lots, for example, to get back to blindness, there's lots of representations of blindness in literature, going back to the Bible and going back to Homer. And all of those representations shape the way that blindness is thought of, and thus shape the way that people actually live their lives as blind people. So here we start to get to literature and also to music, and we're going to be asking the question, how are disability conditions represented in music? How are they shown in music?
Do you mean how disability conditions impact on music written, performed by someone who has physical disability, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. In a moment, I'm going to talk about a number of different ways that music scholars have thought about disability. One of the ways they've thought about it is they've looked at pieces of music, as I'm going to do today, and to think about the ways in which disability plays a role, just as you would look at a work of literature. So you might look at a work like Shakespeare's Richard III, where the central character, Richard III, has a humpback. He's deformed, he's disfigured by his humpback. And you can think about, what is the meaning of that? How does the representation of disability in Richard III reflect contemporary attitudes towards bodily deformity? And how does it shape those attitudes and lives by people? There's an American novel called Moby Dick, where the main character is missing a leg. And that also seems to be quite significant in the way he's represented it. And if you think about the books that you read and the things that you've read and seen, and you start thinking about the representation of disability, you'll realize that there are representations everywhere. It's extraordinarily common, and that they fall into certain kinds of ways of representing disability. Lisa, I think someone had a question a second ago.
Yeah, Alex, you had a question. You can ask.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've actually know a few cases with contemporary composers who are former musicians who lost ability to play. So, example, they are over practicing their hands or mouths, and they use this disability as a part of their style, composing style. So their music become a part of, like, it sounds like it is played by disabled musician. So I found this interesting.
Okay, you're anticipating, and you're one step ahead of me. So I was going to enumerate some of the kinds of projects that musical scholars have undertaken with relation to disability, and you've already named, Alex, you've already named two of them: composers with disabilities, performers with disabilities. In both cases, the questions are like this: how does the composer's disability affect the music that they write? How does the performer's disability affect the way they play music? And in both cases, how does the disability affect the way people listen to them, listen to the music, and listen to the performances? How does it change the way people think about those performances? And so I'm going to pause again for a moment. I'm just going to ask an open question. Can you think of and name in the chat, if you will, name composers with disabilities? Can you think of any composers with a disability? If you can, write it down.
Go ahead, guys. Chat is open for you. Якщо ви знаєте когось з композиторів, які мають disability, будь ласка, напишіть в чат українською чи...
Yeah, Beethoven, of course. And, right at the center of the Western canon of music is Beethoven's deafness. Does Beethoven's deafness affect the way he writes music? Yes, it absolutely does. Does it affect the way people think about their music? They think about Beethoven's music? Absolutely, in all kinds of really interesting ways. So Bach, what was J.S. Bach's disability?
Blindness.
Blindness, yeah, late in his life he became blind. Did it affect the way he wrote music? Certainly in a physical way it did. He had to dictate. Did it affect the quality or nature of the music he wrote? I think a good case can be made. Does it affect the way people think about the music? I think it does. One of the cliches about blindness is that blindness paradoxically represents a kind of higher vision, that people who are blind see more deeply. And I think some of the mystique around Bach's late music and also around Beethoven's late music is that it is affected not in negative, but in positive, mystical ways by their disability. So I think Bach's blindness and Beethoven's deafness are similar in that respect. I think there were others, Lisa.
Yeah, Smetana.
Yeah, what was Smetana's disability?
Actually, I'm not knowledge with that. So, Vlada, can you specify it? While Vlada is writing about Smetana, it's also from Facebook chat from Oksana Rindenko. It's Ravel's Concerto for Left Hand, or also Bortkiewicz Concerto for Left Hand as a part of the examples.
Yes, and those are fascinating stories. So a lot of the main concerti for left hand were commissioned by Austrian pianist named Paul Wittgenstein, who lost his arm in the First World War. And he was a wealthy guy and a very good pianist. And he commissioned a bunch of prominent composers, including Ravel and others, to write music for him for left hand. So, there's a performer with left hand. Does his disability affect the way he plays? Yes, obviously. Does it affect the kind of reception response that people give to him? It absolutely does. It very much affects the kind of music people write for him. There's a really interesting literature on concerti for the left hand. It's quite a fascinating subject. So anyway, so you get the general idea. It turns out that when you start thinking about this, you think about composers with disabilities, performers with disabilities, they're everywhere. It's not just a narrow, one or two composers. So many composers who were central to what we think of as Western music had a conspicuous experience of disability. Smetana was deaf late in his life. Was probably and he thematized that in his music. And you haven't even mentioned
Beethoven.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Say it again.
Yeah, it also was Beethoven, as I understood. Yeah.
Yes, also Beethoven. So far you've talked to me mostly about physical disabilities and sensory impairments like blindness and deafness. But of course, there's the whole world of cognitive or mental or emotional disability as well. Madness is the sort of common language term. Madness or cognitive impairment or idiocy. People who are mentally different in some way. And there's lots, if I asked you about composers and performers who are understood to be cognitively different, mentally different in some way, to have mental illness, for example, again, the number is huge. And people usually start that conversation with Robert Schumann, who very famously tried to kill himself by jumping into the Rhine and was committed to an insane asylum where he lived for the last several years of his life and died there. So, are composers or performers sometimes understood as being mad in some way, insane, mentally ill? Again, it's very, very, very common. Listeners with disabilities, the people with different bodily configurations, experience music differently? Well, that's a really interesting question. Deaf listeners certainly do. The deaf community has a deep relationship with music, but it's not the same as the hearing community. Deaf people hear differently. They understand music differently. Do blind people hear different music differently? Well, they have a whole braille notation which mediates their experience, and that's different. And so it turns out that bodily configuration matters a lot. If you walk through the world as opposed to rolling through the world on a wheelchair, does that change your experience of music in some way? People have written about that, I think, in rather interesting ways. So how does disability affect the way you hear music? That's an interesting topic too. Words about music. You can look at the way people write about music and think about the metaphors that they use. So, people who say that a particular passage is fragmented, they say it's aimless, they say it doesn't go anywhere, they say the passage moves haltingly. People use all kinds of metaphors of motion, for example, to talk about music. And in many cases, the motion is impaired in some way. So one thing that disability scholars have done is look at the language that people use to talk about music, and to the extent to which that language is itself all about bodies, and in many cases, disabled bodies. The music itself, that's mostly what I'm going to talk about later today. We'll look at some pieces of music together and think about the ways in which these pieces of music are about disability in some sense. Music in relation to various disability cultural groups. Well, it turns out that, different groups, like, again, I use the example of deaf people, they have, organizations that make music. There are orchestras now for people with mental illness. There are orchestras for blind musicians. There are all kinds of social institutions that have grouped around, musical institutions that have grouped around disability conditions, and that's increasingly common. Life writing. So it's interesting to hear musicians with disabilities talk about their own bodily experience, and there's a big literature there as well. And finally, there's pedagogy. So I'm not going to talk about pedagogy much today because I'm more interested in other, more directly musical issues. But how do you teach students with disabilities? How do you accommodate students with disabilities in the classroom? All of those are really profound and important questions. And I'm going to pause now because in a moment I'm going to undertake a slightly more formal presentation of some of the same ideas I've been presenting informally so far. Are there any other questions or comments at this point?
While people are writing or thinking, there's also a comment about Chopin, Stevie Wonder, also Schubert as an example for composers. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so exactly. So it turns out that the list is endless. Once you start compiling a list like this, it's endless. And the question, how does the disability affect the way they make music? How does the disability affect the way people understand the music? All of those things are really interesting. So if you think about, blind African-American jazz and popular musicians, people have named Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder in the chat. That's a whole interesting culture. And there you have a fascinating intersection of race and disability. I should say race, gender, and disability all intertwine as they always do. Lisa, are there other comments here that you want to share?
No, also like Ray Charles and Schubert, for example, as well.
Okay.
An explanation. Yeah. So far, no questions or comments.
Okay. So now I'm going to present in a slightly more formal way some of the same material, and then there'll be other opportunities for questions and comments, and then at some point we'll start to look at some specific musical pieces. All right. Human bodies and minds are infinitely various, an astonishing biodiversity and neurodiversity. In different times and places, this infinite variety is partitioned into normal, healthy, able-bodied, and abnormal, unhealthy, disabled. This distinction is a social or cultural construction, not a biological or medical given. Disability in this view is relational. It's something that happens between people and the ambient culture. Disability is not a pathology that resides in an individual's body. The same social construction logic applies to other identity formations like gender, for example. Gender clearly has some sort of biomedical basis, but as many scholars have shown over a long period of time, gender is also a cultural or social construction. And by the way, I'll digress to say, I think this is a useful analogy for you to think about. So, initially people have thought, well, with regard to gender, there is just the differences are obvious. It's a biological thing. But then people have thought more deeply, well, actually, a lot of the differences between the genders have to do with culture and social interaction. And so gender studies scholars often distinguish between, on the one hand, biological sex, on the other hand, cultural gender. So sex is the biological stuff, and gender is the cultural stuff. And disability studies scholars have often made a related distinction between impairment on the one hand and disability on the other. So impairment means a physical, concrete, biomedical condition. And disability is what happens in the real world to someone who has that kind of body. All right. So disability is a heterogeneous grouping of bodily, mental, and sensory conditions, and I've listed a few of them there, and we already looked at some similar lists. As disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson says, disability is a broad term within which cluster ideological categories as varied as sick, deformed, ugly, old, maimed, afflicted, abnormal, or debilitated, all of which disadvantage people by devaluing bodies that do not conform to cultural standards. So this is a really very, very succinct statement of a basic view here. So I want to dwell on this for a second. Disability is a broad term, she says, within which cluster ideological categories. Ideological categories. What does she mean by ideological categories? She says sick, deformed, ugly, old, maimed, afflicted. These are ideological categories. How are those ideological categories? And then she says, all of which disadvantage people by devaluing bodies that do not conform to cultural standards. She's saying, well, if you're classified as ugly, that's a disability. It's an ideology. There's some underlying belief set, underlying view that classifies your body as ugly. It's not because there's anything actually wrong with you. It's just because in a given cultural context, your particular configuration of bodily parts is judged as ugly. And the effect of that judgment is to devalue a body that does not conform to a cultural standard. So ugliness is not a biomedical condition. Ugliness is a cultural condition. It's an ideology. And the same thing is true of deformed and maimed and afflicted and abnormal. All of those things are cultural categories. All right, despite the apparently clear-cut binary, disability is a fluid category with permeable boundaries. Some people are born disabled, but people may become disabled temporarily or permanently, and all of us, if we live long enough, will become disabled. We can broadly think of disability as a deviation from a normative standard for appearance and/or function of bodies and/or minds. Every human difference, every deviation from the norm has at least the potential to be understood as a disability. Beyond changes in individual circumstances, disability itself is constantly shifting. Some disability conditions vanish while others emerge amid the endless reconfiguring of human difference. And I want to pause here for a second to ask if you can think of examples of a disability, something that used to be considered a disability but isn't anymore, or something that didn't used to be considered a disability and now is. Can you think of any examples of either of those things?
Ви знаєте, що якісь приклади порушення або виключення з норм стандартів, які раніше були такими, а зараз вже не вважаються такими?
Let's take the first question first. Can you think of any diagnoses that you might have gotten if you had lived 100 or 200 years ago that nobody gets anymore? The diagnostic category is considered to be old-fashioned and illegitimate.
Actually, the only thing that came to my mind, it's how people were trying to treat women of their madness, like the history of inventing vibrator and all these things.
Okay, so I mean, a diagnosis that women used to get a lot was hysteria. Okay,
Yeah,
that was considered a medical diagnosis, hysteria. That's gone. Okay, for various reasons. Now people understand, well, hysteria was never really a medical condition.
Yeah.
It was always a cultural idea. It was applied to women who were uncomfortable adapting to whatever the oppressive social norms of the time were. So they were judged to be hysterical, and now that's not considered a diagnosis anymore. Somebody said homosexuality. I'd like to ask that person to say more. In what sense is homosexuality used to be a diagnosis and it's not anymore? So can let them say something about that, please.
Yeah, actually, and also Vladislav wrote that women study in educational institutions work, and so the fact it's not medical, it's just biological that women are not to study anywhere.
Right, and so and that was considered at one time absolutely natural. People didn't think that was cultural. You know, women were understood as being intellectually inferior and physically weak, and therefore they should stay home. And people weren't thinking about that as a cultural or social thing. People were thinking, well, it's a biomedical thing. Everyone knows that those things are true. And of course, it turns out upon closer thought, well, no, those you know, there are differences, but those differences are not necessarily pathologies. Rather, they're differences that we might actually not learn not only to accept, but also to celebrate. And that brings me back to the homosexuality point. I don't know who made that. Okay, well, so someone is saying here, Alyona, am I saying that right? That homosexuality was considered a mental disorder and a disease until as recently as the 1970s, and that's exactly right. At least in the US, the main manual that the psychiatrists used to diagnose people listed homosexuality as a disease. So it's a perfect example. There's a naturally occurring human difference, which is medicalized and pathologized, and then the people in the white coats come and try and cure you. All that medical logic gets applied to something that really is basically a cultural and social grouping.
And also I see here overweight, like fatness or something, as not a probably medical disorder, but a shape of the body that was not normal. Yeah, and now can see artists like Lizzo, who like Adele, who was also like living on this side because like you're not gonna get the big stage because you're not the type. So.
Right. So there's still a huge stigma attached to fat, and it gets medicalized as obesity, as though it's a medical condition instead of a naturally occurring human difference. In other words, there's nothing intrinsically unhealthy about fat, and the idea that we measure your body mass index, and if you're over 30, then that's bad, and we have to give you surgery and all of that stuff. All of that stuff is a medical intervention on a naturally occurring human difference. So diagnoses come and go, and I think that's important to know. Psychiatric diagnoses in particular come and go. So things that nowadays are considered, self-evident medical categories, like, I don't know if you have, the various anxiety disorders, there's ADHD, there's all kinds of diagnoses that are used now that weren't used 50 years ago. And there's a whole bunch of other diagnoses that used to be used and aren't anymore. Nostalgia used to be a medical diagnosis, and now it's just a common word. All right. So disabilities come and go. They are cultural formations as much as they are medical things. Disability studies offers a sociocultural model of disability. Although disability is concrete, physical, and real, it is also an imaginative creation, a cultural formation, a historically contingent way of making sense of human variety. Disability studies views disability as a culturally stigmatized bodily difference. So that's the crux of the definition here. Disability is a culturally stigmatized bodily difference. The sociocultural view of disability is at variance with the more standard medical model, which views disability as a pathology, deficit, or abnormality that inheres within an individual body or mind. Under the medical model, disability is seen as requiring the intervention of medical professionals to remediate, cure, or normalize. More than 1/4 of Americans have a disability, and I would imagine this is pretty typical for European countries as well. This minority group has become increasingly politically active in recent years. So I'm showing you pictures there of social and political activism on behalf of and by people with disabilities. There's the image there on the left is a group of mobility impaired people crawling up the steps to the US Capitol, where the United States Congress meets, because it was disability inaccessible to them otherwise, and they're trying to make a point about disability accessibility. Disability conditions like deafness, madness, and autism have become the source of identity and pride. So these people have no desire to be cured or normalized. And again, I'm giving you some images here. Autistic Pride Day. So people with autism have banded together, and what they say is they're not sick, they're not diseased, they have a different way of being in the world, a way of being in the world that's not negative, but actually positive. They have a culture. There's a deaf activism poster there, and there's a group called Mad Pride, which does the same thing. It's people who have cognitive and mental differences shouldn't be stigmatized and locked away. Rather, they can group together as a cultural grouping. All right, in our musical world, we have become increasingly aware of composers and performers whose distinctive musicality is enabled by disability. So we already named a lot of people, and I've got a different grouping here. You see Beethoven there on the left. The violinist Itzhak Perlman is there in the middle. The bass baritone Thomas Kostov is on the upper right. Stevie Wonder is there. Robert Schumann is there, and a really interesting 19th century composer and performer named Thomas Wiggins is down there below Beethoven. So I'm just affirming here what we already discussed, which is that when you start thinking about disability and composers and performers with disabilities, it's very, very easy to multiply the examples. All right. Disability is widely recognized, represented, and narrated in literature and other forms of artistic expression. These representations and narratives both reflect and shape conceptualizations of disability and the lived reality of disability. Music, including its institutions, its composers, its performers, its listeners, including all forms of music making, is one of the cultural arenas in which disability is represented and in which disability is lived. But disability does not just affect people with disabilities. Indeed, the sorting of bodies into able-bodied and disabled, which I'm calling the ability-disability system, enmeshes us all. Whether we think of ourselves as able-bodied or disabled, as long as we have a body, and I think that applies to all of us, we're caught up in the system, privileged or stigmatized by it. The ability-disability system is powered by ableism and intertwined with the similarly oppressive systems of race, gender, and sexuality. So race, for example, now, at least in North America, is very widely understood as systemic. When people talk about systemic racism, they mean racism doesn't have to do necessarily with some individual's attitude. It's woven into the culture in a deep way. And the same thing is true with ableism and with the prejudice against and stigma applied to people with disabilities. Just as we all have race, gender, and sexuality, ability and disability are fundamental aspects of being human. The ability-disability system affects everything we do, including the ways we make music and the ways we understand music. So I want to turn now finally to my principal topic for today, which is post-tonal concert music composed in Europe and the US between roughly 1900 and 1950. I'll argue that modernist music represents bodies and minds that deviate from normative standards for appearance and function, that is, bodies and minds that are disabled. Indeed, the musical features that make music modern, its fractured forms, its immobilized harmonies, its conflicting textural layers, its radical simplification of means in some cases, and its radical complexity in others, can be understood as representations of disability conditions. So that's going to be my approach. I'm going to look at some of the features of musical modernism, and I'm going to relate those to features of bodies. I will argue that modernist music practices an aesthetics of disability, as described by art historian and disability scholar Tobin Siebers. Siebers says that the representation of disability is one of modernism's defining features. Disability aesthetics refuses to recognize the representation of the healthy body and its definition of harmony, integrity, and beauty as the sole determination of the aesthetic. Rather, disability aesthetics embraces beauty that seems by traditional standards to be broken, and yet it is not less beautiful, but more so as a result. So Siebers claims bluntly, the modern in art manifests itself as disability. And I'm going to make the same claim about modern music. I'm going to argue that music is most distinctively modern precisely in its representations of disability, and that these representations lead not away from beauty, but toward a different kind of beauty. In its representations of disability, modernist music expresses a profound ambivalence toward disability. The modernist period is an age of eugenics, when disability was widely viewed as something to be either cured or eliminated. Artistic representations of disability might suggest pity associated with cure or rehabilitation, or they might suggest fear or horror associated with incarceration or elimination. At the same time, modernist composers turn toward disability for its liberatory potential, for the promise it holds for shattering conventions and for establishing new canons of beauty. Many modernist composers claim disability as a generative artistic resource. Now I'd like to get down to specific cases. We'll look together at modernist musical representations of, depending on time, of 4 disability conditions: deformity or disfigurement, mobility impairment, madness, and idiocy. So we'll take these conditions one by one, and we'll look at some musical examples of each. In discussing deformity, mobility impairment, madness, and idiocy, I'll be drawing on my recently published book, Broken Beauty, and I'm showing you the cover of the book here. Deformity and disfigurement enter modernist music as the shattering of traditional norms of formal continuity. The modernist musical body is fractured, deformed, and grotesque. Modernist musical form is often based on jagged abruption. It is often made of isolated fragments. Deformity and disfigurement can be represented by the grotesque distortion of a traditional formal type. A traditional symmetrical form can be rendered asymmetrical. The sentence is a traditional type of phrase. It symmetrically balances a presentation consisting of 2 statements of a basic idea with a continuation leading to a cadence. There is symmetry within the presentation and between the presentation and the continuation. In modernist sentences, the symmetry is distorted, deformed, and disfigured, and I'll show you two such modernist sentences. What I'm going to play now is an analytical video that is part of the book Broken Beauty that I showed you the cover of a moment ago. In that book, instead of the usual musical examples printed in the book is accompanied by a series of about 100 analytical videos. So I'm going to show you in a moment is an analytical video of Bartók's string quartet. The modernist sentence that opens Bartók's fourth string quartet, the conventionally symmetrical sentence, which balances a presentation and a continuation, is rendered wildly asymmetrical. So let's listen to that.
The sentence is a traditional formal type. It is.
Sorry, let's see if I can make that work.
The sentence is a traditional formal type. It is usually symmetrical, with a four-measure presentation consisting of two statements of a two-measure basic idea, balanced by a four-measure continuation, with fragmentation of the basic idea and rhythmic acceleration leading to a cadence. The beginning of Bartók's fourth string quartet from 1927 evokes that traditional form, but radically deforms and disfigures it, mostly by rendering it asymmetrical. Basic idea. Basic idea repeats. First attempt to continue to a cadence, but too abrupt to be satisfactory. Second attempt, but this one is too long, too repetitive, too weighty. It grossly unbalances the form. The traditional sentence form is deformed and disfigured.
Here's another example from, this one's from Varese.
Octandra begins with a sentence that is reasonably typical in its proportions. One measure basic idea, repetition of basic idea, three measure continuation to cadence. But the form is deformed from within. An aimless continuation leads to an unexpected cadence. One measure basic idea, basic idea repeated with slight variation, fragmentation and acceleration toward a cadence. But the continuation lacks direction, and the cadence, when it comes, doesn't really feel cadential. It seems to occur in the wrong place and at the wrong time. This is a sentence, but a deformed, distorted, disfigured sentence.
Okay. In a moment, I'm going to go on to some other conditions, but actually I'm going to pause for a moment here to see if there are any questions or comments about this idea of deformity or disfigurement as applied to traditional formal patterns.
In this case, probably it's better to raise hand than to write in chat, but wherever is more comfortable for you.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, questions will come up as we go. What I might do now, in the interest of time, is I might jump ahead past the mobility impairment discussion, although interesting as it is, and talk about madness. Now we turn from disability conditions of the body affecting bodily appearance or function to disability conditions of the mind. The medical term is mental illness, but I prefer the non-medical common language term madness. And I'm particularly interested in the phenomenon of hearing voices. Throughout human history, people have had the experience of hearing voices, verbal utterances in the absence of any actual external source. Under the regime of modern psychiatry, that experience is understood as the symptom of a serious mental illness, usually schizophrenia. But some people may experience the voices as welcome or consoling. Elise, I want to pause this for 1 second. Is schizophrenia, is that a common term for you? Can you translate that if not?
Yes, it sounds like schizophrenia in Ukrainian. It's the same, just different pronunciation.
Okay. In modernist music, voice hearing takes the form of extreme quotation practices, where the music incorporates references to pieces whose musical style is quite at odds with the prevailing idiom of the piece. The quotation is heard as though from outside the frame of the piece. I'll offer 2 examples of extreme quotation practices that create the effect of hearing voices. My first example of hearing voices is a passage from the second string quartet of Charles Ives, American composer active in the early decades of the 20th century.
Ives's compositional style is based on borrowing. In string quartet number 2, the music is mostly in a vigorously dissonant atonal idiom, no triads, no major or minor scales, no sense of key. This defines the central consciousness of the piece. Into it, a bunch of voices suddenly erupt, conflicting with the central idiom and with each other. This movement is called discussions, and we begin in a densely chromatic imitative environment. Chromatic, atonal dissonant environment. Lines wedged together and apart. No vestige or hint of triads or traditional tonality. Then a series of familiar tunes. Columbia Gem of the Ocean. Dixie. Marching Through Georgia, Turkey in the Straw. Hail Columbia. As the tunes subside, the music resumes its original course and its original idiom. The piece establishes a unified consciousness based on dissonant modernist atonal relationships and rhetoric. Then, at a certain point, the music starts suddenly, abruptly, to hear voices that come apparently from outside. The voices are not prepared, and they are not subsumed back into the fabric. Rather, they are disruptive and cacophonous in relation both to the principal voice of the piece and to each other. In some pieces by Ives, one senses a furious attempt on the part of the piece to cling to a unified consciousness in the face of multiple voices that threaten to overwhelm it. And the explicit agenda of many theorists has been precisely to insist on the unity behind the apparent multiplicity, by finding motivic, harmonic, or programmatic links among the multiple voices. In the second quartet, however, we find a lack of concern with integration and an apparent comfort with the sort of divided consciousness that voice hearing suggests. No cure seems possible or desirable because the voices are not experienced as symptoms of mental illness in the first place.
So I hope you understand the general point here. I'm not saying that Ives is mad. And I'm not saying, what I'm saying is that the music represents madness, specifically represents the phenomenon of hearing voices. And of course, a lot of the impact would be stronger if you all were familiar with these tunes. These tunes are pretty well known in America, and certainly in the first half of the 20th century. Many of those tunes, which date from our mid-19th century Civil War, every listener to this piece would have recognized those tunes and would have been rather shocked to find them popping out in the middle of a string quartet. All right, so here's another example. This is Schoenberg's second string quartet, and I'll just let the video play.
Schoenberg's second string quartet dates from 1908. Its final movement is Schoenberg's first work without a key signature, but even in this scherzo movement, the music is densely chromatic and tonally indeterminate. Into this atonal context, a blackly humorous folk tune suddenly intrudes, Ach du lieber Augustin, with a waltzy papa accompaniment. The melody, the heard voice, is gradually liquidated. That's Schoenberg's term for the dissolution of a melody, and the original themes of the music are reconstituted. There's then a modified recapitulation of the music from the beginning of the movement, and everything proceeds as if the heard voice had never been sounded. It seems to have no impact on the course of the music. Densely chromatic, contrapuntal and atonal. Canon between violins. Canon between viola and cello. Motion stops on a whole tone harmony. Dramatic pause. Scherzo tone on top, folk song in the middle, and canon with itself, papa waltz bass. Tune is fragmented. The bass continues but gets nowhere. The bass dissolves and sighs. The opening motive of the scherzo returns. Recapitulation, the beginning of the scherzo movement. The music continues as if nothing had happened. The quotation intrudes suddenly, unexpectedly, then dissolves and disappears. It is felt retrospectively as a sort of dream, set apart from the normal daily life of the work.
All right, I'm going to move ahead now. Even in the absence of quotation, modernist music frequently stratifies the musical texture into discrete layers, irrevocably dividing the consciousness of the piece. And I have another example of a piece like that where two very, very different things are going on simultaneously, but I'm going to skip that example now in the interest of time. And I'm going to talk at least briefly about a disability condition traditionally called idiocy, a condition that has been medicalized and stigmatized under a variety of pseudoscientific labels, including imbecility, feeble-mindedness, and mental retardation. It has almost always also been racialized, with non-whiteness associated with mental deficiency. So there's a quotation there from a reference to a psychiatrist, a British psychiatrist named Langdon Down, who thought that idiocy, people with cognitive impairments, could be labeled as Negroid idiots or Malay idiots or North American and Indian idiots or Mongoloid idiots. So his idea was that there was a kind of racial classification that was appropriate to understanding cognitive impairment. And a later textbook by another psychiatrist named Treadgold says, their intelligence does not come up to that possessed by primitive social man. So the idea is that people with, quote, idiocy are primitive in the same way that inferior non-white races are primitive, and that those two ways of being primitive are related with each other. It's actually quite a horrible, horrible history. And to me, another example of how diagnoses that may seem on their face to be neutral medical diagnoses very, very often, perhaps always, have an important cultural and social component as well. So a term like imbecility or feeble-mindedness, those terms seem harsh and horrible now, but in their day, they were considered neutral medical terms. In literature and in music, the most prevalent representation of idiocy is the so-called holy fool. The holy fool is a character whose intellectual deficiency is compensated by purity of understanding and a deeper, if inarticulate, wisdom. Holy fools are authentic and sincere, uncivilized and primitive, pre-linguistic and pre-rational, natural and animal-like, childlike and innocent. And I'll give you one example. Let me see which example I'm going to choose here. Yeah, I'll give you this example here. There's an American composer named Virgil Thompson who wrote an opera called Four Saints in Three Acts with a libretto by Gertrude Stein. And that opera, I'm arguing, represents idiocy as a holy fool. And it does so by way of music that's radically simplified in all domains. And as we'll see, there's a racial aspect to this as well.
Gertrude Stein's libretto engages many of the principal literary tropes associated with idiocy, including a radical simplification and frequency of repetition that disassemble language, stripping it of its normal communicative function and reducing it almost to nonsense. Thompson's music follows suit, as in the text. The simplification of materials and the constant repetition strip musical materials of their traditional meaning and their traditional propulsive character, cultivating a deliberate sense of musical incompetence. The melody uses only the notes of a G major scale and moves almost entirely by step. Short melodic fragments repeat. The harmony consists of nothing but an alternation of two chords. The progression 1-4-1 has a decidedly non-propulsive quality. Melody and harmony clash occasionally, as though the composer were naive, untutored, virtually incompetent. The radical simplification of musical and linguistic materials enabled this work to represent a state of non-reason, of idiocy. The religious nature of much of the text and staging suggests that we are in the realm of the holy fool. Thompson's insistence on an all-black cast, in deference to what he perceived as their inherently childlike qualities, suggests the deep association of idiocy and racialized others.
Here's a performance of that same passage by the original all-black cast.
Scene 11.
Pigeons on the grass, alas.
Pigeons on the grass, alas.
Shot along the grass, shot longer, shot a yellow grass. Pigeons large, pigeons on the shorter, longer yellow grass, alas.
So let me make just a few concluding comments, and then we'll have some time for some questions. I've tried to show that the modern in music manifests itself as disability, that modernist music has a fundamental interest in representing the disabled human body, and that modernist music claims disability as a crucial artistic resource. For modernist composers, disability is a source of enduring fascination, a means of shattering conventions and establishing new structural paradigms and new kinds of beauty. At the same time, modernist music is enmeshed in the history and culture of disability during a eugenic age. Its representations of disability often reaffirm oppressive stereotypes. They may exoticize or infreak disabled bodies. The modernist musical response to disability is complicated, abounding in ambivalence, conflict, and self-contradiction. But even amid a eugenic culture and a tendency toward the exoticization and infrequent of disabled bodies, modernist musical representations of disability reveal the aesthetic and physical beauty of disabled bodies. In the process, modernist music practices an aesthetics of disability and changes our sense of the beautiful. Modernist music embraces a beauty that seems by traditional standards to be broken, and yet it is not less beautiful, but more so as a result. Okay. Thank you all. And I think we have some time now, Lisa, for questions.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you for that fascinating presentation. And I hope some people have a question. But while people thinking, I have one follow-up question regarding Ives, I guess. How can we distinct? Is it the music that he or the person, like in the musical narrative, hears from the outside, or he's hearing voices in his head, which could be madness? Like, I probably have an answer for that question, because these chromatical passages on the background could be like could point what that could be interpreted. But how do you distinguish these things?
I'm not making any comment in any of these analyses about the mental state of the composer. I'm not saying I'm not saying Virgil Thompson is mentally defective. I'm not saying that Ives and Schoenberg are mad. I'm not making those claims. What I'm saying is that they are representing that condition, those conditions musically. So just as an author in a fiction might write about a character who has had a leg amputated, or might write about a character who is blind, in exactly the same way, these composers they depict, they tell stories about human disability conditions, as I tried to show. So the representation is in the music, not in the mind or body of the composer necessarily.
Yeah, sure. That the question was mostly about how to say, in the Ives example, the quotations, we can interpret them as there is a like person or someone in the narrative, in the music itself, not Ives himself, that or either hears these voices outside, like he goes on the street and he hears all these quotations, and that's like different people, or he hears or she hears this inside his head. So
yes.
That's
I think I understand now. Yes, in the Ives piece, there is a consciousness. There seems to be a kind of narrator or a protagonist there who's going through his or her life in a kind of normal way. And suddenly, out of nowhere, they start hearing these voices. So there's a kind of implicit hero in the story there, and things are happening to that hero. That hero is doing things and having experiences. And at this point in the piece, the hero is having experiences of hearing voices from, and not sure from where they're coming from. So I think that gets better to your question.
Yeah.
So it's not about it's not about the mind of the composer. It's about the mind of the piece. The piece is a body. The piece is a mind, and that body and mind of the piece undergoes various experience, sees and understands various things, and that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, great, thank you. Якщо ви маєте питання, будь ласка, українською чи англійською, українською зможемо перекласти. Yeah, I can read you one comment from Alona Dorosh. I don't actually have a question, but I can tell you how my disable affects piano playing. Surely, if you want. Alona, please, we really, I think we would.
Yes, please, please.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
My disables based on eye diseases, because I have bunch of eye diseases like amblyopia, strabismus, hyperopia, and other. And my eyes have a difference in visual acuity, like 70%. It's tremendous number. So yes, and my right eye is leading in my pair of eyes, and usually my world's divided by two. And when I play the piano, my vision relies on my right eye, but sometimes my left eye make an extension of piano keyboard, so I can cover by my left eye the lower octaves. So sometimes it could be bizarre. Actually, it is pretty hard to explain specifically, and you can just imagine that you have a double keyboard in your perception, like in your perception, there are two keyboards that floats in the air, and sometimes you consider it like you have two keyboards, but sometimes you also can see it as one. But actually, it doesn't interfere me from playing the piano since childhood. Yeah, I know it's pretty bizarre, and sometimes I can call it shenanigans between my brain and my eyes. So.
Alyona,
Like
first I want to say thank you very much for explaining that and telling us about that. And I want to ask you a question. You know, you've explained very clearly some of the challenges that are involved in your particular condition. And I want to ask you, are there any advantages? Is there something distinctive about your way of playing that results from your condition? Is it, in other words, is it all just a negative, bad thing that you have to work to overcome, or is any of it nourishing and generative for you?
Maybe I can say that I got used to it from my childhood, so it is not a problem to me, but sometimes it can be problem for people which I met and which I meet in my life. Some of my teachers was a little bit embarrassed, but when I explained these problems with my eyes, they say it's okay. And teachers always treat me like I didn't have any disables or something like that. About advantages, I don't know really. Not nor advantages or either disadvantages, but at school it was a huge disadvantages, because my classmates always laugh at me, always blame me, and always stigmatize me, and sometimes I turned mad because of it, because why me? Yes, that is.
But you have so great sense of humor, because we were living in a bomb shelter together. So I think that's a really weird but advantage of what you have been struggled to.
Yes, I like these jokes about my eyes.
No, I mean, in general, your sense of humor, it's really like a bit dark, a bit like rough. I like that.
Right. I mean, so people often feel that their body is a generative source for the way they do what they do. So maybe I shouldn't have said advantage. What I should have really said is distinctiveness. You know, do you or perhaps other performers think of their own individual and distinctive ways of making music as related to their bodily conditions? And I think the answer is often yes. So to say advantage, disadvantage, that's a little bit crude. What really I meant was the distinctive ways in which people make music grow out of their bodies and the experiences of their bodies in the world.
That's great.
Thank you so much.
Does anyone else have a question? Alexander.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, my question might be a bit hard to me. Well, I try. So I know this practice of Maria Abramovich, and she makes herself disabled in order to provoke people to stigmatize her. And did you found similar practices in music, that it's not a statement like this opera All Black Cast, but rather provoking audience to stigmatize that this people or
explain that more, Alexander. I'm not entirely understanding. Describe the situation to me.
So yeah, have you
I think what Alexander is telling about is about when people mimicking to provoke to see the art as disabled, like they don't have disabilities or something, but they are writing it, and it's an act of it's a position of other, or it's like it's paying an attention to an art and to this problem, to this issue, like this.
Well, I mean, people perform disability in all kinds of different ways. I'm going to do my best to try and get to this in sort of more general terms. Some performers, since that's what we're talking about, try and downplay the disability and try and fit in, try and pass as able-bodied. So people like that sort of deny that the disability has anything to do with anything, and they don't like it when people call attention to that disability or are aware of it. So that's one mode that people use. Sometimes people call attention to the disability, to their disability, very deliberately, either as a provocation or simply because the disability is highly visible in any sense. There's no way of running around it. There's no way of pretending otherwise. And so they incorporate it then into their self-presentation. Sometimes they can exaggerate it if they wish, maybe for commercial purposes or for other purposes. That's possible. It's also very common, not so much in music, but certainly in film and theater, that non-disabled people play disabled roles, extremely common, in a kind of disability drag, you might call it. And they often do so in highly offensive and improper and stigmatizing ways. So when you think, for example, about how intellectual impairment is portrayed in film, when you think, for example, how often blindness and deafness are played for laughs, people bump into things and misunderstand things, often disability is understood as comical, or sometimes disability is understood as giving evidence of evil in some way. And so disability is represented usually by non-disabled people in all kinds of really terrible ways. So disabled performers have options about how they want to perform their disability. And non-disabled performers often pretend to be disabled for all kinds of reasons and in all kinds of ways, often in terrible ways.
Thank you.
Also, if someone has a question, please go ahead. Also, Irina Tukova, the professor at the Ukrainian National Music Academy.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, your conception, and now I will begin in probably other way about music of modernism, and I have probably more naive question, but it is very interesting, your analysis and your different points of view of the examples that you showed us. And as you think, the composers, for example, for me, very interesting, your example, this music by Bartok. Then Bartok composed this quartet. If he understood that he made this state of disability?
Thank you so much for that question. I don't think that Bartok would have put it in exactly my terms. So I don't think he was necessarily thinking consciously of a body which is deformed or perceived as deformed or defective in some way. I probably not. But I think I'm sure he was quite conscious that the way he was writing was deformational with respect to symmetrical norms that he had inherited and studied in school. So I think the purely music analytical part of what I said, I think Bartok would absolutely recognize and understand that his music is often written against, in contradiction to the norms of form and harmony that he had inherited. Whether he would have made the leap that I'm making today to relate that to disability more generally, I don't know the answer. He might very well have said, no, that had nothing to do with it. That's not on my mind at all. But frankly, Irina, that wouldn't bother me. My feeling is, I'm interpreting the pieces the way performers and the way musicians always do. I'm trying to make sense of what I'm hearing. And I understand and perceive the music in relationship to disability. Today and in other talks, I've invited other people to hear things the same way. I think hearing in this disability-oriented way is very enlightening and very enriching. So whether or not it was part of Bartok's conscious intent, and it probably wasn't, doesn't even bother me that much. What Bartok is doing in writing against the tonal conventions is so deeply a part of modernism, and the language around it is often language about bodies, about defective and deformed bodies. So often people have described the music in that way in the past. That's what emboldens me to make the kind of interpretive leap that I'm not sure Bartok would ever have made.
Thank you. And you compare, for example, classical period as normal state and modernism like disability. Yes, I correct understood your idea. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking about the classical conventions as the norms against which the modernist composers are writing, and against which most listeners actually still, even to this day, hear the music. So very often when you talk to people about modern music, they say, well, it sounds like a distorted version of some earlier music. It sounds like music that refuses to obey the rules, refuses to do things the normal way. So I think the idea that tonal norms, tonics and dominants and sentences and periods and all that stuff is a kind of normal background against which composers write, that seems to be a very, very widely shared notion, including by the composers themselves.
Yes, and for example, the period of middle of 19th century, then we have changing from tonal system to its complexity in different ways, and how you interpret this period.
That's a really big question, which I'm not going to try and answer. What I'll say is that when you start thinking about disability in the kind of broad cultural way that I'm talking about it today, you become aware pretty quickly that disability is absolutely everywhere. It's in every TV show you watch, it's in every movie you see, it's in every book you read, and for me, it's in every piece of music that I listen to. It manifests itself in all kinds of different ways, and that's where the interest comes in. So if your question is, do I think that representations of disability play a role in mid-19th century music? The answer is absolutely yes, but I'm not going to let you pin me down today on exactly how. That's a good topic for you or for somebody else.
Thank you very much. It's a really great, interesting idea. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.